Remember the 400 is a nonprofit organization that works towards making August Freedom Month internationally to help unite the children of the diaspora, as well as put on educational programs to continue to teach. And don't forget the past 400 years that we have been dispersed from Western Africa. So it's important for us to keep it alive. So hats off to Remember the 400 Foundation and to the individuals who actually started this way back, I think 2017, leading up into 2019 milestone. So welcome everybody that's coming in. I see it's starting to fill up a bit. That's really good. And again, we have a stellar panel. We have actually another individual who'll be joining us shortly as well. But let me just give a second. Hey, everyone. Yes. Hello, Levi. Hello, Pansy. Hello, Tony Walker, Thomas Glover. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you guys for joining us. All right. So we have, this is the Playing It Forward to the Future Generations. Let's talk about reparations. Let's talk about reparations. So, every year for Freedom Month, we have one of these discussions. Different topics I've facilitated a couple years ago as well. So I'm glad to be back. Thank you for having me back. And especially for this topic, because this is near and dear to my heart. I remember maybe about, 15, 20 years ago when I first became aware of just the concept of reparations, that there was an active movement afoot towards trying to push for reparations. I remember there was just a lot of buzz about that, and I was going to meetings, and a lot of things were happening, it seemed, and then it seemed to fizzle out a bit, and then hear things here, there, and the other. So I'm glad Remember the 400 is creating this platform so that we would be able to talk to individuals, a few individuals that are on the front lines of the reparations movement, so that they can tell us firsthand, not gleaming it through the media, not gleaming it through CNN or anything else, but firsthand, what's going on in reparations in their area, and even also what is it that we can do, individuals in this audience can do to contribute, if we so choose to as well. But information is key. All right, so let me start a bit with just some of the introductions to who are our panelists that are here. Again, welcome everybody. It's going to be a dynamic dialogue. I definitely want individuals to feel free to be able to post their questions and comments so that we can address them as well. I think so that could be really, really fruitful. All right. So let me start. I'm going to start in California, and I'll introduce Camilla Moore. Camilla Moore, welcome. I'm pronouncing it correctly?
Yes. Thank you for having me.
All right. So Camilla Moore is a reparatory justice scholar and attorney with her specialization in entertainment intellectual property law. As a law student, she contributed to the human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, including but not limited to racial inequality in Brazil, the human right to sanitation in Lodez County, Alabama, and the human right to remedy for indigenous Black women affected by racialized gender violence in Papua New Guinea. While studying abroad at University of Amsterdam, Moore wrote a master thesis exploring the intersections between international law and reparatory justice for the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. She earned a Juris Doctorate degree from Columbia Law School in New York City, a Master's of Law degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. Camilla Moore was appointed to the California Reparations Task Force in 2021. Welcome to the panel, Ms. Moore. Thank you for being here.
Thanks again for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Absolutely. Also, we have Mr. John Dower, is a director working in film, television, and games. In 2016, he discovered his ancestors had been plantation owners in Grenada, receiving compensation in 1834 when enslavement was abolished in the UK. This began a 7-year journey to attempt atonement for his ancestors, culminating in the family presenting their apology to the people of Grenada in the capital, St. George, in February of this year. They were the first British family to do so on Caribbean soil. Since then, John has been active in the reparations campaign, speaking at several meetings and being a founding member of hearsofslavery.org. hearsofslavery.org. Thank you, Mr. Dower, for being a part of this panel. Look forward to speaking
Thank
with you.
you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we got coming in, Mr. Harrison, Mr. David Harrison. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Harrison served in the United States Air Force for 25 years. He currently works for the Orlando VA healthcare system, Lake Baldwin campus in Orlando, Florida. He's active in his local community, service as vice president of the Orange County Voters League, member of the Black Advisory Committee, Valencia College, member advocate for Equal Ground, a member of RAFMAN, which is the Retired Air Force, Marine, Army, and Navy Club, Incorporated, education liaison, scholarship committee, associate dean, Congress number 2 and 1st District South, 1st South Florida Missionary Baptist District Association, associate minister, Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, Orlando, Florida. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for being a part of this panel discussion as well. So, like I said, everybody that's on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you. And you see, we have a great panel. We have individuals from Florida, from the East Coast. We have individuals from the West Coast, California. We have individuals across the pond, as they say, from the UK, all talking on this topic, all the things going on concerning reparations. So you don't want to miss the discussion. Again, please share, please, invite your friends to be a part of this. All right, so let's get started. Let's start in Florida, Mr. Harrison, if you don't mind. I read the bio, but please tell us a little bit about, first of all, sort of in your perspective, what is reparations and what is it you're doing concerning reparations in your area? Oh, you sound, Mr. Harrison. You're on mute. Okay, yeah, I think you're good.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, reparations in a nutshell, the way I see it is that it's making amends for a wrong. With that, there are many, many, many years of wrongs that would need to be righted by our governments, our local officials, but more importantly, our national officials. How do you make right? 40 acres and a mule is not in the equation today, but I do see that there is a concerted effort to remove, or at least here in the state of Florida, remove that there's any qualitative or quantitative contributions from the Black community as it relates to
I think
our existence and our thousands of years in order to have those wrongs righted. But one of the key things is reparations would be good if we were to assign a monetary value to that. That would be great, fine. But first of all, we've got to learn how to handle what we do have. What do I mean by that? We have to be taught how money works. We need to be taught how financing works. We need to be taught how to invest. Because one thing that is critically important to me is that if and when there is a settlement, then how do we put that settlement to good use in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities, in our own businesses, or working together collaboratively as far as to raise the values of our respective locations and communities. It's a broader paintbrush than just say, okay, give me a check for X amount of dollars. We do know that it's still going to be a struggle. Voice, influence. I'm vice president of Orange County Voters League. One of the things that is most important that we see is that you can have almost a 100% constituency registered, but only 30 to 40% that turn out. If you don't turn out to have people that represent you in the way, and also that will be willing to get in the way in order to bring those equative summaries to our communities, then you don't have a voice, and our voice is muffled by the lack of participation. So that's something that needs to be looked at and looked at really closely.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Harrison. Yeah, I think there were some technical issues, at least for me, kind of going in and out a little bit. But I think I definitely got most of what you were saying. I believe, generally speaking, about education of individuals in the community about the nature of reparations, as well as the whole thinking it the whole way through, not just on the front end, but even on the back end. Well, what is the result after, let's say, reparations is awarded? And then also the piece about participation. You guys are on the front lines trying to go through that analysis as well as implementation. And so the question is then you can't do it by yourself. You need support in order to make it happen and to maybe galvanize people in order to do that, if what I'm hearing correctly. Miss Moore in California, what can you kind of take it from there? Kind of what's your perspective on reparations, and what are you doing along those lines in California?
Sure, and to what David said, yes, that's where I start. The layman's term for definition is simply exactly what he said: making amends for harms done. In the context of the California Reparations Task Force, you had Assemblymember Shirley Weber, when she was in the Assembly. Now she's California's first Secretary of State, introducing what is called AB 3121, which was a legislative statute that once passed would create this 9-member state commission comprised of academics, activists, clergy, scholars, all tasked with traveling around the state over a course of 2 years to not only study, but also to develop reparation proposals for African Americans, with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. And so I was one of those 9 members on the task force. I served on the task force as chairperson. We collectively began our work June of 2021, and the task force sunset, or we ended our work July 1 of 2023, so about a couple of months ago. And to conclude, in terms of the work product we produced an interim report last year that comprised 500 pages, 13 chapters detailing not only the horrors of enslavement and California's unique role in enslavement as an institution. We also explored, obviously, the national government's role in that as well. But we also, what we characterize in those 12 remaining chapters, characterize those lingering badges and incidents of slavery. Those 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that still persist and linger on and negatively impact descendants of slaves predominantly. And then again, just to conclude finally, in terms of the work product, just this past couple of months, we produced a final report that's 1,100 pages long, reproduces that interim report, but also contains final recommendations based on those badges and incidents of slavery that I mentioned. And so now it's up to the California State Legislature to digest that 1,100 page final report and start to create legislation around those recommendations. And then ultimately, it'll be up to Governor Newsom to sign that legislation into law.
Amazing. I don't know if individuals know, I didn't know quite fully the extent that California is going into really studying it. As Mr. Harrison had said, that idea that education is a big part of it. What was that like, putting the committee together? Was it a hard push? Was there pushback? Like, what was that process like, Ms. Moore, if you could?
Sure. So the committee was, so the governor had 5 appointees. So the governor of California, Governor Newsom, selected 5 people to serve on the task force. The Speaker of the State Assembly, Anthony Rendon, selected 2 people, and the Speaker of the State Senate essentially had 2 appointees as well. And so between the time that the legislation that created the task force passed and was signed by Governor Newsom, October 2020, to around May 2021, that's where people were being interviewed by those 3 appointing officials to be on the task force. Anyone in the state of California could apply. So I don't really know too much behind the scenes about how it was selecting people, but I know, I applied to all 3 officials just to increase my chances, got interviews with them, and then ultimately was appointed by the Speaker of the State Assembly, Anthony Rendon, in May of 2021. And we had our first hearing June 2021. And in that first hearing, I was elected by my fellow task force members to serve as the chairperson and then the vice chair person was Pastor Amos Brown, who was a renowned clergy member as well.
Yeah. Wow, what a process. And I know in the news, the headlines when it comes to California reparations, there's a couple things pop in my head. One is, and again, I'm just paraphrasing how it gets received. So California proposes every African American gets $5 billion check. And that was kind of it. And then they talk. Then you had the talking heads talking about it like it was such a was that something? Can you bring some clarity into what that's about as far as what some of the recommendations were coming out of the California Task Force?
Sure. So the task force, we recommended over 111 policy recommendations, all of them comporting with what we call international law. So under international law, very briefly, there are 5 forms of reparations. And technically, it's stated you can't really call a program full and effective reparations unless it includes all 5 of those forms. So we recommended cash payments because compensation is one of the forms of reparations under international law, but we also recommended recommendations in the areas of restitution. Restitution is that second form, and that could look like, and what we recommended, the idea of taking into account Black Americans who've had their land dispossessed via unjust property takings. And so what does that look like to account for that, either by, giving them the land back or by compensating them for that land? So think about what happened with Bruce Beach in Manhattan Beach, for example. We recommended policy recommendations in the area of rehabilitation. So generally speaking, that could look like free healthcare, free mental health services, things like that. And so the task force, we recommended, for instance, the creation of Black wellness centers in Black communities to support our Black Americans' mental, physical health and wellness. The 4th form of reparations under international law is satisfaction. So, that could look like a formal apology on behalf of the state of California for its unique role in slavery. For instance, there were over 2,000 Black people living who were enslaved in the state of California. California had a fugitive slave law, so it was not a sanctuary state by any means. If a Black person tried to run away to California for refuge under that law, they could be deported to be re-enslaved in the South, or in some instances enslaved in California soil. And then the 5th form of reparations under international law is, guarantees of non-repetition, which is arguably one of the hardest forms of reparations to achieve, because it's really taking into account, like, how do you get the offending party or state to guarantee to stop harming the victim group. And so that can look like, real structural and institutional policy change. And so just to conclude, one of the final recommendations the task force came up with in that particular area was the creation of a new state agency, tentatively called the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, paying homage to the Freedmen's Bureau that once existed in the country, in the nation, to help transition, newly freed slaves from pure subjugation to freedom. That was dismantled because of Andrew Johnson's racism. And so the idea is, what does it look like to maybe have something like that on a state level to provide ongoing direct reparatory justice services to descendants of slaves, but also provide some oversight to existing state agencies and institutions to make sure their rights aren't being abridged. So those are just a few of the touch points of the recommendations and how they corresponded with those 5 areas of reparations under international law.
All right. Thank you for that. So a couple questions on that. Number one, is it possible to give us a link for that so that we can maybe post that so people who'll be interested in seeing the report, hopefully does send the report as well. And then also, does one of the questions that came from Felicia, how do we ensure that an African-American descendant of slave, in other words, how did your recommendations take care of eligibility? Like, is any Black person in California eligible, or how do they prove eligibility?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And out of the 2 years the task force took to do this work, we took almost a year just trying to figure out who would be eligible. So like nearly 10, 11 months on this question. And the task force, we resolved it by via 5-4 decision to affirm lineage-based eligibility rather than race-based eligibility. So that means that just those who are descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States or descendants of free Black people living in the United States prior to 1900, they would be eligible, particularly for cash payments and some of the major other forms of recommendations that we recommended. What went into that decision very quickly? We invited over 6 expert genealogists to talk about the feasibility of it. And you would assume that because they're, career genealogists, they would say, yeah, this is feasible. Let's do it. Let's do a lineage standard. But when they provided expert testimony at the task force, they really were professional in talking about, the potential difficulties, but then also giving us some guidance in terms of how this lineage standard can be feasible. We also consulted with legal experts like UC Berkeley Law School Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, who's one of the foremost constitutional law scholars in the country, and gave dispassionate expert testimony and said, if you want, these reparations legislations to have the best chance in surviving, legal scrutiny, constitutional scrutiny, then he suggested a lineage-based rather than a race-based framework, predicting over a year before the outcome of this affirmative action case, right? And so getting to your question more directly, in the recommendation to create an agency, a new state agency, there would be an office, a genealogy office, an eligibility office. Those branches within that agency would work together to essentially assist claimants in determining their eligibility for these reparation proposals, particularly in the areas of cash as well. So, it could look like, again, if they already have that documentation, because many Black Americans have done this work, it can look like them coming to the agency, bringing in their paperwork, so to speak, and having these genealogists verify it. Or, the idea is allocating significant resources to this state agency where these board certified genealogists will be assisting claimants free of cost and to ensure that they're eligible, because the idea is that burden of proof, so to speak, shouldn't rest on the individual. It really should rest on the state. And we're talking about reparations nationally, on the federal government as well, in recognition of the harm, right? In recognition of the state being responsible for our ancestral ties being severed in many ways.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. So yeah, the link, thank you for that. If one of the producers could please post it in the YouTube channel so people can see it if they want to take a look at that. It sounds very comprehensive. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing on that. It sounds like it's could be a blueprint for other states that may be looking at this. And so I'm wondering, Mr. Harrison, I don't know if you're familiar with that report, and if you think, is that helpful for you in Florida, something like what they're doing there? Like, this is happening. It's not like we should do this. Like, this is the report is there, and it has at least the writing of the report at least has the backing of the state. So we'll see how we push it forward. But at least that's a big step. Would you agree, Mr. Harrison? And what's your thoughts on that? Oh wow, thank you.
Yes. That is a terrific blueprint, a starting place, a starting point. To be able to correctly identify. We do know that it will take time, just like your web-based ancestry.coms or things of that nature, where you can trace your history, but to be able to go back as far as possible to see where the bloodline started, and then from there, making sure to be able to close the loopholes of who qualifies and who does not qualify. That I see that probably being a
I think Mr. Harrison, I think you're going in and out. So
Reparatory more than actually. I would love to take that blueprint and I will be looking at this site to be able to channel that as a starting point, and it's going to take
Great.
a lot of energy and effort in order to make it done.
For sure. Yeah. Like you mentioned, there has to be support around that. So let's bring in Mr. Dower into the conversation. What are your thoughts so far on what you're hearing as far as some of the work that's being done here in these states?
Well, as you may imagine, I mean, clearly things are more advanced than they are in Europe. I have to start with that. And I guess, and also don't forget, we don't have a federal system. So we have a government-wide, country-wide system, generally in most countries. I suppose the major difference and the reason this is happening is because the enslaved were not on British soil or European soil; they were on Caribbean soil in the case of the UK, and therefore, in a way, we displaced, the wound that we created, and that means I think that we are behind, but we are hopefully. I'm not saying we're catching up, but there is positive movement in Europe, and maybe I can Jeffrey, just give you a kind of little roundup of where we're at.
Yes, please.
There are apologies, which is obviously where things need to begin. I mean, that's where my family, the Trevelyan family, we began with an apology for what our ancestors had done. Because from what I can see, if there isn't an apology, sincere apology made with humility for what our ancestors did, we won't move towards reparation in any kind of meaningful way. I think people have to mean it. So I think that is beginning to happen. So there are families doing that in the UK. The Church of England has apologized and set up a reparations fund. Many say it's not enough. It's something like £100 million. But that's something, and it's the beginning of something. The Dutch government, the Netherlands government, have apologized and set up a reparations fund, as has the King of the Netherlands. So there is some positive news coming from Europe. We've just had news that with Heirs of Slavery, which is an organization we set up with 8 different members, all of whom are descended from our ancestors, were plantation owners and involved in transatlantic slavery. And we are both an advocacy group, but we're also trying to persuade other families in a similar position as ourselves to start thinking about making apologies and starting to make reparation. And we're beginning to gain traction. I mean, we are planning a conference that's happening later on in this autumn, this fall, in London, where we're going to be meeting with other members, other families from a similar background, to try and persuade them to start thinking about what they might do. And we're hoping that pressure might build on other institutions, bigger institutions. And we're aiming for the government. The government ultimately, we think, have to apologise and engage with CARICOM, particularly in the Caribbean, and other reparations campaigners in the UK. And we have to be realistic about the King, who is probably the person in Britain who's making the most kind of positive sounding. You sort of feel like he's quite sympathetic to apologising and to thinking about what he might do about the royal family's involvement in transatlantic slavery, which is considerable. Mm-hmm. But of course, his hands are tied because ultimately he is at the beck and call of the government. So he won't be doing much without the government say so. But I do feel as though there is movement in Europe, and I don't know whether that's something that you're feeling from over the pond, but I feel as though there is positive news coming. And certainly you may have heard, it's just been announced that Charles Gladstone, who's a great, I don't know how many greats, but many great grandson of William Gladstone and John Gladstone, who was the biggest owner of enslaved people in Britain at the time of abolition, and received a great deal of money in so-called compensation. He's about to go to Guyana with an apology for his ancestors' role in enslavement there, and it's on the 200th year anniversary of the Demerara uprising. So I hope I'm bringing some kind of sense of, it's not good news, but I feel as though there is movement. I feel as though there is something happening here.
So I appreciate that, and absolutely. And hey, again, hats off to Remember the 400 creating this platform so that we can know. Like I don't know anything about reparations taking place in the UK or Europe if it wasn't for Remember the 400 and the connections through there. So I'm glad for you to do this, and for you and your family to be able to, when you come to the knowledge of those things, they're like, oh, you want to address it, and starting with that the apology. Beyond the apology, which is again a big step, but are there other pieces, maybe something similar to what we spoke about California, that the families are looking into? Any way of?
Well, sure. I mean, Yeah, we were aware that our apology would seem pretty thin if we didn't try and back it up with some kind of attempt to repair. I mean, having said that, what we do in terms of reparation as a family is only ever going to be seen, I think, as a token, unfortunately. But we have given £100,000 to the University of the West Indies in Grenada to go towards educational projects. And then we are also setting up a charity within the Trevelyan family, which is going to be using our resources in the family to put money particularly into education projects, both at university and at primary school level on the islands of Grenada. I mean, we're particularly focused on Grenada because that's where our ancestors were involved in slavery. So we're encouraging, and we do on our heirsofslavery.org website. You can go on there, and there are lots and lots of different charities and organizations that we advocate people think about giving money to. But as I say, I mean, for us, I think the really important thing here is that we are using our example to try and put pressure on bigger organizations, which is something that, I think is very much happening in California. They're talking at a federal level and ultimately at a state level. We need to be talking to the big boys in the room, the governments and the royal family, because these are the organizations that have resources and can do something profound and fundamental that might move things forward.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, Ms. Moore, Mr. Harrison, do you have any questions or anything for Mr. Dower? Or any panelists for any other panelists?
If he could just expand on that last point in terms of like going after the big boys in the royal family and some of those, major institutions, if you care to just expand a little bit on that.
Well, if you think about what the British government gained, and for example, the amount of money that came over from sugar, the whole trade, from sugar, from tobacco, from cotton, but mostly sugar, from the Caribbean, was huge. But the tax on it that went into the government coffers was massive. And when the government paid so-called compensation to the owners, the plantation owners, and the owners of the enslaved, it took 50% of the country's GDP that year, £20 million in 1833, when the money was given out. So the government gained. They gave out a lot of money because they had to, because they realized they were not going to be able to get slavery abolished without appeasing the very influential and rich owners of the plantations. But I mean, the amount of money that came into the country in the form of compensation that went into things like the railways, it went into the infrastructure, it funded so much of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. I mean, the country has really, really benefited and gained from all of that terrible the sources of money that it gained from. So we're really keen that the government take responsibility and really start to talk about what they can do to address this, these crimes of humanity against humanity and the terrible wound it caused.
Yeah, I know that portion of I don't know. I've heard the term reparations used for it as well, given to the slave owners in order to free the slaves during the emancipation. That again, it was such a large debt on the country that was, I think, up until 2015, it still was being paid down.
Yeah, I think the government made a mistake in 2015, and they tweeted that they just paid off the debt, and I think they didn't really mean to tell people, because that's a really interesting piece of information. So until 2015, we the British taxpayer, which included, of course, people of Caribbean descent, and people who may well have been descendants of the enslaved who were in Britain, paying off that debt. I mean, there's a real irony there.
Yeah,
and what's interesting is that
that's one word, irony. That's one word. Yeah, I can think of words.
Yeah, there are many words, of course. I mean, it's terrible. It's a terrible truth. But I mean, at least it's truth we know. And I think it gives us some kind of argument when people say we can't afford reparations. You go, well, actually, you were paying compensation, so-called. I mean, I call it so-called compensation. I think we should put inverted commas around it to to the owners of the enslaved. I mean, it's terrible. It's very shameful.
Yes, yes. Let me go to some of the questions that some of the individuals. Let's see. I'm just starting from C Fields. Will California reparations be set at the time of enslavement, or will it be calculated at today's value when it talks about? So I guess that goes calculation piece.
Yeah, so the task force, we recommended that the state provide cash payments for 5 areas: health harms, mass incarceration and over policing, housing discrimination, unjust property takings, and devaluation of Black businesses. So notably, these 5 areas of compensation, they're not necessarily based on enslavement, but they are based on enslavement in terms of the only folks who will be eligible for these cash payments are descendants of slaves. Because the idea is that these, post-slavery instances of state-sanctioned discrimination and exclusionary public policy were weaponized against descendants of slaves to prevent or to completely destroy our opportunities to build wealth, education, Black businesses, things like that. And so the economists and the public policy experts we retained came up with formulas to pretty much figure out what is the monetary losses of the Black American community across those 5 areas. And so just to I guess, how would you say, clarify, because you noted something earlier in terms of the media. It was a lot of horrible misconceptions floating around in the media where, it was stated that the California Task Force is recommending like this or that, $5 million, $800 billion. And that's not necessarily the truth. What we recommended was a little bit more sophisticated than that. So in terms of that $800 billion figure, what that represents is we're not saying, okay, state of California, you owe Black Americans $800 billion right now in this legislative session. No, what that $800 billion number represents is the amount of monetary losses, pure monetary losses across only those 5 harm areas. We explored and studied other harm areas outside of those 5, but we only were able to collect sufficient data and evidence to support a claim of state culpability within the short 2-year time frame that we had to come up with formulas for those 5 areas. So within those 5 areas alone, it shows that Black Americans who descend from slaves have lost over $800 billion since California's statehood to present in those particular areas because of the actions of the state itself, because of discriminatory policy weaponized against Black Americans by the state itself. So again, just to conclude, now it's up to the state legislature to read Chapter 17 in the final report, because that details all the compensation formulae. It's up to them now to digest, read that, study that, and then along with their constituents, have conversations, debates, and ultimately prescribe a monetary amount for each of those 5 harms based on the formula that we provided to them.
So thank you for that. I'm hearing, I know we got like about 5 minutes or so, and there's a lot of questions here. Would you guys be willing to do a part 2 if we needed? Because I feel like we just opened the door. We couldn't even sit down and relax and go through the whole thing because it's a lot. It's a lot here. But
this is a huge subject.
It is. Yeah, so if you guys is that okay that we can do a part 2
sounds good.
of this? Okay. There's one question I do want to get out there, and I think it's something that everyone in the audience seems to be, all for this, it sounds like, and from the comments. But you have other people on the other side of the argument who are like, I don't know, wait a minute. Let's say from American context. Hey, my family came to America maybe 50 years ago, worked hard and built things and got a family business and doing this and the other. Well, and now you want to take money from me to pay for this for Black people that I had nothing to do with. What is the argument to that person that reparations is something that should be pursued? Anybody can jump in if they.
I would love to hear the other two panelists' ideas on that. But what I've said personally is that if you,
I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
sorry.
Mr. Harrison, did you have a? I think your connection is kind of going in and out a little bit, a little delayed. Were you able to get the question, Mr. Harrison? Oh, I think he's delayed. Yeah. Go ahead, Ms. Moore.
Briefly, I'll just say, if you immigrate to a country, you immigrate for its benefits, but you also have to take into account any nation's liability. So, if I were to move to Germany tomorrow, I would still have to pay into that Germany tax system, and Germany still to this day provides some form of reparatory justice to the survivors of the Holocaust. And so I can't just, if I move to Germany, say, well, I had nothing to do with it. In fact, my people were enslaved, and then we had our own form of genocide, apartheid, Jim Crow, and so I shouldn't be responsible. Now, I would still have to, as someone immigrating to Germany, be responsible, and I would be perfectly okay with that. So that's part of the argument that I share with folks.
Yeah, I'd just like to quickly jump in there and say that, I think this is a kind of reflex that people give. And I think a lot of this is about the heat that's kind of generated by, let's face it, we've got a pretty toxic political, vacuum at the moment with the right-wing press, particularly saying stuff like, why should we pay for this stuff? And it's nothing to do with us. In a way, I think it's because there's a vacuum that's been created by government and institutions and those who are responsible not stepping up and actually saying, we need to do something about this. This begins with apology. It begins with that. And then it goes on to having actual grown-up conversations that are lacking at the moment. So I think in the vacuum that's formed by the fact that people are not, I'm talking really about governments, royal families and large institutions that made a lot of money from the transatlantic slave trade, in the gap that's been created by none of them owning up to their responsibilities, the right-wing press, I would say, is jumping in and going, in Britain anyway, I'm sure it's the same in the States, and heating up this kind of notion that we should all get upset about money being taken from us. None of that's happened yet. What we haven't even got to apology in the general situation. That's what we need to do first. Then we need to start having conversations with people like CARICOM and with the institution that you're talking about in California so brilliantly. There's so much work to be done before we can start to say to people, yeah, you're going to be paying this. I feel like people are just jumping. That's like a reflex response.
Yeah. And I feel a part of that is why education is so important. And
we really lack that.
Like in Florida and other places in the States where they're really pushing to suppress or to characterize that error as something different than what it actually is, then that makes it hard to have a conversation.
We're so lacking education in this country. In Britain, we really have a problem. We don't even have the we don't even teach the kind of nuts and bolts of how the empire was created and our colonial past. That's not part of the curriculum. So schools teach it by choice, but not that. It's shameful.
Yes. So, Mr. Harrison, we're right at time. Mr. Harrison, did you have? So I'm pointing. So we have to, and so I'm asking, but really respectfully demanding that we see there's a lot of questions here that we didn't get to, but we definitely want to follow up with this. I want to talk with the producers that are member of 500 to try to schedule a part 2 because we really, really want to get to some questions, really great questions that were there. I want to thank you guys for this discussion that we're having. And again, I think it's just so important that we, the left hand knows what the right hand's doing and understand it's not just a reparations movement, like a general thing, but there are a lot of little pieces and things that are working along the way. And if we could speak to each other, then we'll be able to what you're doing there might be helpful to me over here. As a matter of fact, you can use it as a precedence possibly for one area and the other. And as well as continue the education. Like we can't get too far if we're only relying on propagandized information and not really having the education of what happened over the past 400 years. So that's why I'm a part of the 500 Foundation, so that we can really be able to tell our story, and to make sure we create platforms like this so that people can be educated about what's happened, also what's happening, so that we can make decisions about going forward. I want to thank everybody that's a part of this panel. I want to thank Ms. Moore. I want to thank John Dower. I want to thank Mr. Harrison as well. I want to thank Doreen Simpson, the president member of 100, for putting this together, as well as the producers. Thank you, everyone who was here. Sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but again, stay tuned to a part 2. So we continue this discussion. We even save some of these questions so we can even start from that as well, so that we can make sure that everyone gets their voices heard. So thank you, everybody, again.
Thank you.
The rest of it went by really fast, but I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to part 2.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.